Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome you to my GDC 2017 talk about next level creature sound design. And before I actually start, may I remind you to just switch off your phones and maybe put them into quiet mode or flight mode. And I think we are ready to go. So first of all, I want to give you an overview about what I'm going to talk today. So obviously it's about next level creature sound design. And first of all, I'm going to give you an introduction about myself, why am I kind of the right person to talk about creature sound design in the first place. I will give you some initial thoughts about creature sound design because I've been doing this for about the last 7 years. I will also run you through pre-production, the recording process, the design process, and also briefly about implementation. And yeah, so myself, my name's David Philipp, and I'm a co-founder of Noiseworks Limited, an audio outsourcing company in London. And I'm also a boom library recordist and designer. And I worked on a large amount of creature-heavy titles in my past. So for example, Elder Scrolls Online, most of you probably know. Blade and Soul, which is an Asian game, and Arcania is a German game, again, a very creature-heavy title. And over the last 4 years, or the last 2 years actually, I was leading the creature sound effects production for Total War Warhammer, which I think many of you have played, and it's a very creature-heavy title, and I'm very happy to show some insight out of that game and out of the production with you tonight as well. Right, so the initial thoughts, I think that's quite important to ask yourself before you start designing creature sounds. So I think the first question I ask myself is, what's my role as a creature sound designer? And I think the best way to put it is to create sound for something alive, where there's not really a reference in the real world, so you can't just go out and have a look at what a creature sounds like. That's pretty much impossible. And that's a very creative process of make that, make sense to the audience or the player. The second question is, what makes a creature more difficult than other sound effects? It's, again, a very difficult question in a way, but again, there's no real-life reference, and that's definitely a tough aspect about the whole thing. But we're also highly dependent on different layers, which, they can be difficult to blend, and, we always have to aim for making a creature sound like one creature, not many at the same time. And lastly, is the difference between producing creatures for interactive and linear media. I mean, obviously we're at GDC, so it's all about gaming, but, some of you might actually have to create creature sounds for FMVs or cutscenes and so on. And I think the actual production, what we are going to focus on tonight, is actually not that different, but we're going through that over the course of the next hour anyway. So after these, these initial thoughts over the last few years, I came up with, personally for me, the 3 ingredients of great creature sound design, almost like a rule book for myself to create creature sound designs from. So the first point, which always is very important for me, is character. So you probably ask yourself, what do you mean by character? Because people come up to me, they give me feedback on a creature and say they need much more character. They don't have enough character. And initially I didn't really know what they meant. So character is about how does the creature act? What's its characteristics? Is it aggressive? Is it really stupid? Is it highly intelligent? And how do I perceive its emotions? Or how does it react? How does it make me feel as a player? And that's everything on a vocal basis, obviously. Then the next point, the next very important ingredient is variation. So firstly, variation in terms of articulations. So for example, attack sounds, death sounds, pain sounds, idle sounds, all that. But I think also variation in form of sounds we use. So again, during the course of the next hour, we're going to look at different recording techniques to keep that variation always, to keep on top of that. And then the last ingredient is perspective. So quite a simple point really, but it is really important to ask yourself, where does the sound live in our game? And in what space? Is it always indoors? Is it outdoors? Is it in a cave? And so on. Or is it really close up or very far? So do we have to, we have to take care of that as well. And that all comes together in a term which I think is very, very important, and I will use it, and I apologize in advance, I will use it a lot tonight, which is believability. So that's our main aim as a creature sound designer, to make something which I just mentioned before, which isn't real and which isn't in the real world, to make it believable for the player, and that results in immersion as well for the player. So in the next video, I'm going to show you a few examples of creature sounds which for me stand for believability. They just work, and they should get you pumped up for the next hour as well. So let's have a listen to that. So yeah, I don't know about you, but even the Godzilla roar still gives me goosebumps. Actually, just now it happened again. So this is just a really good example of believable creatures, you know, that you can just feel the size, you feel the aggression or the intelligence or whatever, a lot of character and a lot of believability. Right, so we can actually start on the actual process, which we start with the pre-production. And pre-production is actually one of the most important aspects, in my opinion, of creature sound design. And I'm guilty myself of, you know, kind of neglecting that process. And because we always, as sound designers, we kind of want to jump straight in there and actually record a design. So it is mostly overlooked and forgotten about, but I do think it's very important because we always have to be aware of what we work on. You know, I talked about character before, so it's one part obviously, but also what universe is it in and, you know, the characteristics and skills of the creatures we're going to work on. We also need to make ourselves aware of what material we want to use. So creature sound designs, it stands and falls with the source we are using. So we want to plan that as well. One can't pay without colors. It's just, you know, we can't create great sounds without great material in the first place. And also I think at this point it's very important to mention that if you're freelance or with a developer, it doesn't really matter. Pre-production is always important, just that it probably is a bit easier to get the information you need when you're actually employed by someone or in-house. Let's look at the pre-production like a bit of an advanced way in terms of creature sound design. So the first thing I would do is I would find out the creature's origin, its special characteristics and skills. So I mentioned before, you know, like for example, a creature could be highly intelligent, it could be super stupid, it could be, you know, again, it could be very big, it could be very small, and it could have special skills, like for example, a dragon could have a fire breath. I need to know about that. And I need to search, you look for the dialogue between myself and the design team to find out about the special characteristics of a creature in the first place. Then I want to know how does it produce sound in the first place. You know, does it have a voice box? Because I've dealt with creatures before who were actually ghostly. And before actually reading about this creature, I wouldn't know how they would actually produce the sound. And that's again something which dictates the way I'm working. Is there a need for language? That's a very tricky situation actually to be in, and it happened to us in Warhammer because we had creatures who communicated with one another, and that's, you know, I can't really deal with that with my attack sounds and my death sounds. So that normally is very important to know, and it would, in our case, would go to the dialogue team and they would deal with that. But again, if you get to that information very late on in the process, you probably run out of time. Size and their scale in relation to other creatures in game. So this is also a very important one. As you've seen before in the video, you saw Khaleesi's dragon on her shoulder, very small compared to Godzilla, which is obviously massive. But if you just see a screenshot of the game, you know, you see the dragon and you see Godzilla, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them in size. And again, it's very important to check beforehand because it's very difficult after you create a full set of creature sounds to make the sound very small or very big afterwards. And all this will come together and define the sonic character of your creatures. And again, think about the three main ingredients. Character is definitely one of the most important ones. So I hope you can see that. I put like a few example notes together of how I normally approach a creature sound. In this case, I called it random dragon. You can see that on the top left there. And for example, I always do a little bit of a mind map. So first of all, it's just for me, but later on it's really useful to share this information with my coworkers, who might have to work on that creature if it's not myself. So in terms of the large dragon here, the random dragon, sorry, it's a large size. It's very aggressive, it's highly intelligent, it's got a few skills like a fire breath, a tail swing, and then here's probably a good one, is a mega scream, which buffs my friendly unit, so I would already know that indicates that I would have to create that kind of scream later on as well. And also put a note down that it can attack from distance with a fireball, so I probably have to think like from the very start about my distant assets as well and what that brings to the table. And then on the right here on the left page, you can see how, attack, pain, scream, and how many variations I aim to do, and that equals total amount of 42 sound effects in this case, and this is a good indication. I can put it on a timeline and, plan my time accordingly. And on the right, I think that's for myself, it's very important, is the potential recordings I'm going to do, or also the potential source I'm going to look at to just buy from other libraries out there. So for example, I have the 3 types which we will hear later on more about, so humans, animals, and non-literal recordings. And when I think about a random dragon, in this case, I would think about, I record myself because I can do a crazy inward squeal, which would be a great layer for this sound, or I can record Jack, who sounds like a pig, for example, which can be very useful. Then animals, I would, look into pigs, horses, donkeys, elephant, walrus, all that stuff, which, kind of has some kind of quality I would look for in a dragon in this case. And then also the non-literal stuff like dry, some metal, cellophane, door creaks, stuff which doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with the dragon in the first place, but because I've done this stuff before, I can actually tell that might be really handy in the end and add another bit of character to the creature. Right, so we just ran through the pre-production aspect, and we can finally look a bit into recording. Obviously, for most of you will know that different mics equals different results, so I'm going to show you a few of the microphones which I love using and which are really useful for creature sound recording. And I'm also going to talk about the literal approach of recording humans, which is, very important. Then we're also going to look into recording animals. And very importantly, we're going to look at the non-literal approach, which is, in my opinion, the most interesting one. So let's have a look at the microphones. I'm going to show you a little bit of information and sound samples of the Sanken C100K, the Sennheiser MKH series, and some contact mics as well. So the Sanken C100K is, in my opinion, the most powerful weapon of a creature sound designer, and that's because it just picks up signals up to 100 kilohertz. So it allows you, if you record in 192 sample rate, it just captures audio which is way beyond the human hearing. So what that allows us to do is, if we pitch down audio with a normal mic, you would lose all this information as long as you go 1 octave down. You would make the sound very muffled and therefore unusable for our creature sound design purposes. But with the Sanken, and I really urge you to try it if you haven't done so before, record yourself and pitch it down up to 3 octaves, and it would still sound more or less crisp and really, really interesting. A downside of the Sanken is that it's unfortunately an omnidirectional mic, which makes it very difficult to use outdoors. But it doesn't matter. You can still use it in the studio, and outdoors you just have to do a bit more cleaning up afterwards and denoising and debirding and all that stuff. And also a good tip for anyone who wants to record outdoors with the Sanken is that it stops working below 10 degrees Celsius. And so I don't want you guys to find out the way I did, because it just stopped working. And how you can get around that is either wait for a warmer day, or these pocket warmers we have in the UK, once it gets really cold, you just gaffer tape them to the mic, and that gets around that as well. So I do have some example sounds recorded with the Sanken C100K. I think important for you guys to know is that it's the unpitched raw recording first, and then the processed and pitched sound after. So the last example you heard, it was actually one I created for ages ago for Boom Library Creatures, for the designed one. And that just uses human sound. So you can see how powerful that Sanken is. It really is breathtaking, so you should definitely give it a go. Second microphone we're going to look at is the Sennheiser MKH series. In my opinion, it's a great all-rounder. It's probably the mics I use most in the field. And yeah, it is a very popular choice for recording in the field because they, compared to the Sanken, they just pick up they have half the frequency response of 50 kilohertz. But it's actually still great for pitching purposes, which you will hear in a minute. And the positive aspect about the MKH series is that it's also available as cardioid or supercardioid configuration, and therefore you can use it as MS, which is probably 90% of the time what I'm doing. So again, in terms of here a sample with the MKH 8040 in mono and the raw sound beforehand of myself, and then pitched and processed. Yeah, so again, I think you can see that it's still very much usable as a layer in a creature sound, and with the upside of being able to record in cardioid or supercardioid. The next mics we're going to look at are contact mics. So they are, compared to the Sanken and the Sennheiser microphones, they are actually quite pricey. They are the Barker-Sperry you can see here on the right. It's actually not too pricey, normally very durable. I think this one would be about $300, $350, and it really is a great way to pick up different signals. So what we would normally do is we would have either the Sanken or the Sennheiser mic in about a distance like this here, like you can see right here, and then we'd use a contact mic as a different source. For example, I could put it on my throat to create something completely different, or I use it somewhere in the room, something which is resonating, again to pick up a different layer of interest and to be able to choose from that later on down the line. So what you have to keep in mind is that it picks up very dry and isolated signals. So whoever, people in here have used contact mics before, they're obviously very clean sounding, very isolated, don't really record much of the environment itself. And what also is important to keep in mind is there's a very big difference between the budget and the high-end solutions. So the Barker-Sperry has a massive frequency response, and it is really a really good source. And I've used other cheaper contact mic solutions before, which just don't give you the same fidelity. So let's also hear with the Barker-Sperry, let's listen to a few sound recordings with that. So yeah, not necessarily something you would think that would make its way into a creature sound in the end, but again, really, really interesting source, and it might work later on, we will see. Okay, so we have dealt with all the different mics I use on a daily basis, and the positives and the negatives aspects of that. Now let's look what we're actually going to record with those mics. So human recordings, first of all, they are a very powerful source, as you just heard with the samples, especially with the Sanken mic, but also with the Sennheiser. And a positive aspect about humans is they usually perform on command, and they can be directed. So there's obviously individuals who don't do that, but we don't talk about them. So normally they do what we tell them to do, and that's great. And they can normally be recorded in a controlled environment, which it keeps down the time we have to spend on cleaning up all the stuff we recorded, and it's just much more comfortable. And unless you hire actors, it can be done quite cheaply. So what we tended to do in our Warhammer production, we just sent around emails to the whole office, and we asked, can anyone do a really weird sound? And ideally, can you do it in an attacking way, in a painful way, and in an idling way? And we got a few responses, and we recorded them all. And again, what I tried to tell you before is just record as much source as you can possibly think of, because it might come in handy later on down the line. So there's obviously not just positives about human recordings, because after recording loads of different human sounds, it can sound very similar once they're pitched and slowed down. So if I recorded all the people in the studio and later on, I pitched them down 2 to 3 octaves because I want to create some really deep sounding source, and it can sound a bit like a mess, and it's not really, again, if we think about the 3 main ingredients, variation is always key. So we have to incorporate some different recording techniques with the humans to make them sound, to just make them stand out more. Another downside is that humans complain about sore throats and hoarseness. So ideally, as a sound designer, would like to, keep it going until the vocal cords are just non-existent anymore. But obviously, most people don't like doing that. And quite frankly said, it's not as much fun. I can spend hours in the studio and record humans, but I do much prefer doing what this guy on the right here is doing, and and going outdoors and actually capturing animal recordings. And animal recordings, they can be very rewarding, as like certain animals, they just produce great and powerful sounds, and they, I can't just reproduce by any humans. And unfortunately, they are very difficult to achieve, and most animals don't make noises on command. So anyone who, of you people who went out there and tried to record animals, normally when you point your mic towards them, they're completely silent. But as soon as you turn away, they would just start vocalize. So that's obviously annoying, and it's also time consuming. So you have to spend a lot of time in the field recording animals to actually get what you're after. And yeah, and obviously it's mostly outdoors in an uncontrolled environment. So it brings a lot of editing time with it, a lot of cleaning up time, and so on. But definitely sometimes animal recordings are absolutely necessary. Again, in terms of variation, first of all, which I have mentioned just a minute ago. But also certain sounds can't be reproduced by humans, or at least I don't know any. So if you do know any, just refer them to me, because I would like to hear that. For example, horses, bears, seals, vultures, they just have some kind of, again, character to them, which is very difficult for a human to do. So the real thing is definitely best in this case. With animals, animal recordings can be very pricey if agencies have to be involved. So due to the fact that it's a rare thing that an animal can, vocalize on command, there are some agencies in the UK who specialize in advertising, training animals for advertising and movie purposes. But they do know it's a rare thing, and they charge you for it accordingly. So that's obviously a downside. And those recordings sometimes can also be dangerous. So I always, when recording wildcats or stags in mating season, it really is better to be on the other side of the cage, or have a very, very long boom pole at your disposal. So just some tips for you guys in terms of animal recordings, because I'm sure some of you have actually not done one before. I think the first question you have to ask yourself before you go out in the field is where am I recording? So again, with us in the UK, it's a very noisy environment, loads of fly paths and birds and motorways, so it's really not ideal. But you can obviously find spaces which are quiet enough to record those animals. So I would recommend to do a recce beforehand, so just to go there and actually record the surroundings. Again, this is an advantage that you just put that in your archive and you can listen back to it later on. Or you could also share it with your teammates if you're not the one going on the recording, but other people are. You have to make yourself aware, what are you recording? It's a difference of recording horses to recording wildcats. You just might want to have more mics to record horses or less mics. So definitely make yourself aware of what you're recording. And also the question of how much do I think I can get out of it is something you might be confronted by your lead or by your financial director, because they want to know where you spent the money on. And it's a very difficult question to answer, but a tip for you to really get out most of your recordings is to actually talk to the people who take care of the animals or who train the animals, because they would normally know these little tricks. For example, before they get fed, they're really vocal, or if you turn away one of the animals, then they start to get vocal, and all these tricks are really important for you to actually get the sound you're after. How dangerous is it going to be? Again, not really a good question I can help you with. Just plan your insurance accordingly, I guess. And what equipment do I need? As you can see on the right, that's our current boom library setup, which is obviously overpowered for most sessions, but I tend to take more stuff out with me than I actually need to, just in case some animal bites my windshield or bites my cable, that I have a spare one in the car. Right, so now we have dealt with the human recording aspect and the animals. I actually want to do a bit of a listening test with you guys. So I'll show you two sounds, and And I want you to then lift your hand and you tell me which file is made just out of human sounds. So that's sound number 1. I'll play you that again. And sound number 2. Sound number 3. Sorry for that, I played them both together. So, but who of you thinks that sound number 1 was made just out of human sounds? Please lift your hand. Okay, and what about sound number 2? Yeah, great. I have to disappoint you, unfortunately. So sound number 2 was the one which wasn't made just out of human sounds. So sound number 1, my good friend and colleague Byron Bullock made out of his own voice. And I don't know if it speaks for him to sound like a bull or a pig, but it's still very impressive. And sound number 2 was a giant we had in Total War Warhammer, and that I vocalized that myself, but I had to, unfortunately, use some walrus sounds for the guttural thing because I just couldn't produce that sound. So very interesting, again, to hear how we are fooled by, the believability of that sound, especially that boar sound, sound number 1. Right, so now we're going to have a look at the non-literal approach. So some of the best layers, in my opinion, for creature sounds, they don't have to come from humans or animals. So for example, think about tire squeals, balloon stretches, door creaks, dryers on metal, high-pitched scrapes. These are all sounds which can make a real difference in creature sound design. And a good advice I can give you is look for sounds and not for props. And what I mean by that is that, because I'm a bit of a sound nerd and I'm trying to, I'm basically going through my day with open ears, and I have my recorder in my bag or a notepad where if I hear something really weird and really interesting, I either take a note or record it on the spot so I can later on. Doesn't necessarily have to be a Sanken or the Sennheiser mic, but I can at least sketch that sound and I can come back to it later. And that's really important because the non-literal approach is not something you just get up in the morning and do, or if you can, then it's obviously great, but it's normally not the case. It can definitely add another layer of interest to the creature and make it sound different to everything else. And again, all about character and variation and the believability as well. So in this case, you could hear that's a non-literal recording of just some balloon scrapes. So I blew up a balloon and just dragged my fingers on that. And also, I combined that with a human scream. So, and if we listen to that again, just listen to how the first sound is the human squeal, and then it goes into that balloon, and it just sounds like nothing else. And that's really what I'm after in terms of creature sound design. Let's listen to that again quickly. So the non-literal approach is creatively definitely the biggest challenge because it just takes a lot of time to find the right props and the right sounds. But it is definitely the most rewarding because if you can tell someone that he created a great creature sound with just a balloon, they'd probably be amazed. And that's obviously what we want as sound designers. We want the recognition of our other colleagues because most players wouldn't actually know to tell the difference. It's also very time-consuming. Again, because it's just a very time-consuming process to find all these different sounds. And finding the right spots and props to record can be very difficult. So again, my tip for all of you is to just listen out for stuff like that. Like today in the morning, I opened my hotel door and it sounded like, I think it's called Motu of the Godzilla movie. And yeah, so I recorded it and I'll come back to it later and hopefully can use it in one of the future projects. So the next video I'm going to show you is a combination of some of the non-literal recordings we did for Total War Warhammer, also some of the animal recordings as well. So yeah, unfortunately, I have to say that the last cow sound didn't make it in the game, but I'm still amazed that I can actually reproduce a cow sound. So all my people in Austria are incredibly proud of me. So now we actually went through the pre-production process, the recording process, and finally we can actually, what we always wanted to, we can get stuck into design bit. So this is the process where it all comes together. And ideally, after doing all these processes and different recordings, we would know what we want to try to achieve by now. But sometimes it can still feel more like throwing paint on a canvas and seeing what happens. And this is absolutely fine, because at this stage, still now, it's still a lot of experimenting with sounds. And I will also show you a video in a minute where you can see the struggle of trying to make these different layers work together. And I think at this point, I have to stress that the DAW of your choice is actually not important. So I hear loads of people telling me that Reaper sounds more analog or Logic is super smooth and all that stuff. But I can really say that you should stick to the tools you're feeling comfortable with, and also feel comfortable with spending hours and hours on one kind of sound. And unless you obviously have to collaborate with people, because then, it obviously dictates what you have to use. And it makes it much easier to share projects and files with your coworkers. So just a basic statement now. Creature sound design consists of layers. I think you got that by now. Everything I showed you over the last half an hour, there is, hardly ever there will be one sound which is enough. So even though we create a great source material with the Sanken, it still needs to be layered up with different material to, to get to that character we are always after, and to get to that believable creature. So the art of creature sound design is to make all the different layers work together and sound like a homogeneous creature, like one creature and not like many creatures. And so we have to focus our attention on the tonal relation between the different layers. And that's, I think, in my opinion, that's the most important aspect of creature sound design. It's not the plugins, it is the source and the tonal relation to each other. So let's have a look at a video I put together. I tried to show you the importance of, first of all, how the pitch between the different layers works together. I think it's important for you to know that it's not intended to sound super crazy awesome at the end, but I think you will get the message. Just have a look at this video now. So yeah, I think you can see the struggle here. So the initial sound, I was actually happy to start with the growl sound, where all the other layers are kind of pitched to match that initial sound. But then I decided in the end to add an intro sound, which I again really like. But then it completely messed up the tonal relation of my initial layer. So I had to pitch down the initial layer. And this is a very simple example of a very big problem, where you just have to still experiment with different layers, different source. You find yourself deleting stuff, grabbing new stuff. And again, it all comes down to the source and what you recorded beforehand, so you can, or what you bought, library-wise, to really be able to choose from a large amount of source material. So I like to think that approaching those designs can be a bit like arranging music. So because of the whole pitching relationship. So if you think of a guitar riff and the bass, playing to it, then it could either sound in tune, perfectly in tune, and it harmonizes, or it can sound out of tune and a bit bad and just not really matching. So pitch matching is the most important, and plugins can't take that work off you. So again, similar to the guitar example, the creature sound, like the high element, the hiss, for example, and the bass element, so the kind of body resonance, they have to match together. Otherwise, it will sound not believable, and it will sound like many creatures rather than one homogeneous one. So in my opinion, and I think that's quite important for the way I work, is that good source can allow you to work with just volume and EQ. Again, the example I just showed you is not really sounding that great, but you can still tell that it could potentially be great, but there's actually no plugins are in there. This is just just recordings are made, and just pitch, volume, and I think in that example, not even EQ. But nevertheless, there's still plugins out there which are must-have for every creature sound designer and sound designer in general, and I want to show you some of those which I use on a daily basis. So first of all, that's Isotope by X, Morph 2, Elastic Pitch, the Mag EQ, Wave Slow Air, and also Crotus Dehumanizer 2. So I think it's important to mention that, I could probably fill another talk at GDC about Isotope, about its functions and how it makes my life so much easier. Just simply, anyone who goes out in the field or who works in post-production probably has used Isotope before, and we just denoise stuff, declick stuff, draw out birds from recordings. It really is a powerful tool everyone should have a look at if you haven't done so before. Synaptic Morph 2. So this is a plugin which has been around for quite a while, and somehow it just completely went past me, and I didn't know until just a few months, or actually, I think a year ago. And what it basically does, just a simple explanation, it takes one spectral characteristic of one sound and projects it to another. And I mean, just saying that actually sounds pretty cool for my purposes. So have a listen to that example. I just put something together for you. So in this example, I have a metal groan, a non-literal recording, morphed with an elephant roar. And I mean, it's just amazing. Let's listen to it, and I actually want to hear it again. And this is so, again, another out of this world example, which you wouldn't get if you just record an elephant or metal groan, but put together, putting that time in to just experiment with different layers, and with the help of this great tool here, really is worth it. So have a look at that as well. Elastic Pitch, that's just a plugin I love using for not just pitching stuff down, but actually automating the pitch over time. So what I'm also trying to do with my creatures, I'm trying to automate pitch with movement. So for example, if one of my creatures would die in game, I try to get the asset to pitch down when it's actually falling over, almost make it sound like a final breath. And this plugin does it in a really nice way. It doesn't color the sound in any way, and it also doesn't step the pitch, which some other plugins do, so that's a great one to look at as well. The Mag EQ is actually something which most people don't know about. I think that's a kind of a little secret to share with you guys, especially the orange 2.5 kilohertz knob and the air gain. Because of the nature of our layers, where we all pitch them down quite heavily, sometimes even though we record with the Sanken or the Sennheiser, we lose some of the high fidelity. And I find that if I use those two knobs here, that I can just inject a bit of life back into them, a bit of brilliance and a bit of sparkle, which is, again, sounds like a very basic thing, but it actually does make a difference. So again, if you have the chance, download the demo and try it yourself. Wave Slow Air, I don't think I have to say too much about that. It's just a plugin I've been using for years, and it helps me with creating the kind of, that bassiness and the bigness of a sound. And again, highly recommended to anyone, sound design in general, but also for creature sound designs. And then Crotus Dehumanizer 2, which I think is a great tool, because I think version 1 was already amazing, but for me it was the downside that it was a standalone plugin and I couldn't use it in Pro Tools, my DAW of choice. So what they've done with Dehumanizer 2 is amazing, because you have, I don't know how many 100 parameters there are in this plugin, and it's also on a modular basis. You can drag in whatever you want. And it's also fully automatable, and you can really lose yourself in, again, what I tried to tell you guys today is just to experiment. And with this plugin, you have a lot to do. If you want to just, experience all the functions, there's a lot of time to be spent on that plugin. And also Crotus are here at GDC, so have a look at their booth if you want to know more about that plugin. So I've got another video for you. This is actually a creature which made it in the final release of Total War Warhammer. It's a Dragon Ogre, a large Dragon Ogre. And I again captured my Pro Tools session here, and I show you every single layer. You can see what it does, and you can see it sounds quite odd when you play it by themselves, but actually when they all play together, at least in my opinion, they sound quite cool and they sound pretty much believable. Let's have a look at that. Yeah, so you can see the layers by themselves don't sound like much, and it just takes a lot of time for me to just pitch them all together, and then, you know, the high elements would lose all their bass, and with the bass layers I would try and emphasize that bass, and then at the end I get to something like this and I'm very happy, but then I have to do 5 or 6 variations and I'm again very sad. So yeah, I think that's a good example of how it's been broken down, and you know, this is actually an example where I used quite a lot of different layers, because I try sometimes to limit myself, because obviously the less layers I use, the easier it gets for me to actually get them work together. Right, so after the pre-production part, the recording part, and also the design part, we do have to look into implementation, which is the last part of the process, apart from the mix, obviously. And I think it's so important these days that if the implementation is bad, even the best sound can't save it. So it does make me very upset if I spend that much time on a sound, you know, like weeks or maybe a week or 2 weeks, and then in the end in the game it just doesn't sound the way I expect it to sound. So we are dependent on great systems for our sounds to make them shine properly. We really have to, you know, this is very important that they actually do, in Pro Tools or in your DAW, they sound great, but as soon as they come in the game, there's so many different factors, and obviously the mix has to work around it, and it's really important to get stuck into implementation. So in my opinion, implementation is 50% the experience. Again, it's completely useless to spend all this time on all these processes if the implementation is bad. But I also have to say there's countless possibilities of implementing audio. So anyone who worked in games before knows that there's so many different things, you know, there's Wise, there's Fmod, there's so many different engines. Every company works with different tools, and therefore I can't, unfortunately, just show you everything about implementing creature sounds, but what I decided to do is actually to give you again some tips which helped me in the past, especially when working on Total War Warhammer, a very creature-heavy game. You know, for you just to maybe gain some inspiration from. So I think in terms of creature sound design, the hierarchy setup is incredibly important. So again, in terms of Warhammer, we had small, medium, large, and extra large and huge creatures. So again, this is a hierarchy decision we had to make very early on in the process, because you know, many people work on that game, and we have to later on mix that stuff as well. So it's very important to always keep that kind of hierarchy together, almost like the layers of a creature sound design, because it does make it easier in the end to you know, make the large creature sounds bigger than everything else, and not to lose yourself in the hierarchy in the end. Another very interesting aspect, which unfortunately I don't really have time to get too much into today, is the modular approach versus the one-shot approach. So everything I've showed you today was all based on one shot. So for example, I have an attack animation, I make this attack sound, and it would just, you know, I put a trigger point into the animation, it would play in game, and happy days. But sometimes it can be necessary that there's so many different animations that a basic sound set of articulations, like I showed you before of my random dragon example with 42 sounds, would just not do it, because there's too many animations and they would just not sync tightly to the animations. So what we tried to do in some cases with Warhammer and with other games as well is that we tried to, for example, a scream, we would divide them up in 3 parts, like a start sound, a middle sound, and a stop sound, which makes it, of course, that's great for variation purposes. But anyone who has tried to, you know, blend them in game before, it's again quite tricky. So you have the layer problem in the first place, and then you also have to blend between those 3 parts in the game engine, which can be tricky. But again, if you pull it off, it sounds amazing in game because you have the best amount of variation. Distant versus close assets, I think that's a very basic thing to say. It probably seems a bit stupid to talk about it, but I think it's incredibly important, again, if we think about the 3 main ingredients about perspective, that we always, as a rule, and I don't know who set that rule, but whenever I start a creature sound design, I start with a close-up, close to the camera kind of sound. But sometimes it would actually be good to start with a distant sound before and then work yourself, you know, towards the close sound. And how we solved that in Wise before is that we just had a closed sound. We had a distant sound which was created out of a closed sound, but sometimes had to lose some of the layers to actually make it sound distant. So again, another problem we were facing. And then we just blend them over distance and with in-game parameters as like a Q or reverb. Use of cone attenuation, I think, was something which really changed the way we were mixing our games as well. So you can imagine that like a cone coming out of the creature's mouth. And whenever it turns away from the camera, the perspective would change accordingly, and you can automate the EQ, well, not automate, but the game engine would deal with the EQ settings, like low pass and high pass and all that, and it would just, again, work on the believability of our game and work on the believability of our creature sound. Volume equals size, make use of it. This is another really basic thing, and you probably laugh about it if I tell you that, obviously large creatures should be louder than small creatures. But I don't know why it happens so much, but if I look at a hierarchy, small, medium, large creatures, every starting point is actually 0 dB or -10 or whatever, but they're all equal. And it's actually a good starting point to just, do that gain staging in a really simple way beforehand, because it just really makes the whole mixing process so much easier in the end. And another thing, the sweetener layers, which is something we made use of heavily, not just for creature sounds, but also for other sound effects. But for example, if we had big dragon sound, like the huge creatures, like the giants and the dragons, we could actually, if they're very close to the camera, we would play a sweetener sound on top of that, something we created just for that effect to, add a proximity effect, which could be a stereo sound or a quad sound even, to really fill out that space and to make that huge creature, which is already huge, make even more huge, because that's what we want. We want to make everything sound really loud and powerful. So yeah, we are pretty much at the end of my presentation. I'll just give you a summary of the most important aspects, what I've been talking about today. Again, pre-production is key. You definitely have to know what you're working on. I think it's again, very important to mention that the pre-production is important, and it is worth it reading all the books about the creatures, get to know their characteristics and special skills, because it will pay off in your recording process later on and also in the design, and you will always be on brief, or most of the time anyway. Be creative with the recording process, but sometimes the most simple approach can get the most satisfying result, trial and error. So again, with the recording process, it's all about recording as much as you can. Really don't be scared to go out there and just record all day, edit it up, put it in your library, and then later on you can choose from that stuff. I can't stress enough how important it is to really, have enough source to choose from, because when I talk to some of you guys beforehand, before this actual talk, the first question I've always, or I'm most of the time being asked, is what plugins do you use? And again, I think my plugin is the source, and I think nobody can take that away from you if you really record as much as possible. Pitch matching, EQ, and volume, those three ingredients work with good source. So again, this is in terms of the design process, obviously. Stick with those three things for a start. Match the pitch, EQ the elements you want to, and then do the volume offsets, do some fades. And I'm pretty sure it will get you a far way. And I think it's, and afterwards you can use all the plugins in the world, but just make sure that the first step is always pitch matching, EQ, and volume. And I think most importantly, get stuck into implementation if you can. If you freelance, at least try to get involved. So I'm now in a position where I'm freelance again, and I do want to make sure that my sounds end up in the game, as intended, and to sound as good as possible, obviously. And if you're in-house, talk to the implementation team. Sorry, get stuck into implementation. Obviously, in the in-house, it's much easier because you're on the spot and you don't have to write as many emails as I have to do normally. And then finally, believability and character, the most important aspects of creature sound design. If you think about what we're trying to achieve with the whole creating games in the first place, we want to create a universe for the player to get immersed in and to feel at home in a way. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve with our creature sounds as well, to make them believable and to kind of define their character of something which isn't real in the real world, but obviously real because designers designed it. So it's all about believability and character. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I think that's pretty much it. Actually, again, if you could fill out the evaluation form, that would be great, because we always like to get feedback on our talks. And I hope you enjoyed it, and obviously I'm looking forward to answering all your questions now.
So I'm curious about your process for making variations. So once you have the first, variation, do you tend to be able to just rely on modulating those existing source assets, or do you have to bring in totally different assets for the other variations?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good question, and I can't believe I haven't covered that in my presentation, but it's a very good, so again, when I was talking about the source, obviously, what you normally do is you create, so if I record myself screaming, for example, I would create several different variations of that in the first place. So then later on, and also all like modern libraries do that as well. They provide one sound, but they also provide 8 different variations or 6 variations. And then what I would do is, as long as I get one sound to work in my session, like an attack sound, for example, I would then duplicate the whole thing and try and shift everything. So I use the next kind of variation of that, see if it works, and then the whole game starts again. It probably doesn't work, so again I would replace layers, but again obviously because I already set some kind of style with the first variation, then it gets more complicated. But yeah, I would tend to duplicate the sound and try and just to change the files itself,
okay,
and then see again if it works. And if it doesn't work, then I have to restart.
So is it actually the opposite? You leave the modulation and pitching more or less the same, and then
yeah, no, I mean obviously the pitching can vary, so that's oh yeah, I see what you mean. No, yeah, I would leave it the same, because most of these sounds would then work. But then if I play the second sound, if I play the second variation, the pitch is again shifting slightly. I then go back into the different layers and try to match them together again. And then for the third and fourth and fifth variation, it's exactly the same.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Hi. So I think I know the answer to this, but I'm asking just in case. You're pitching the layers to match them so that they fit together, and then are you then doing more expressive pitching on the master bus to kind of pitch the whole thing up or down if you want to make it more expressive?
Yes. So I think you're referring to that example of the elastic pitch plugin. Yeah, it really depends. So as you said rightfully, I try to pitch all the different layers together first of all, so that harmonizes and it sounds like like believable. And then yeah, exactly, on the master bus I could have like an elastic pitch plugin which affects all the layers at the same time. And for example, when the creature falls over, I just go like that, pitch it down or pitch it up when it does a kind of raw sound effect to just add a bit of more like a point of interest to it. So that would happen on the master bus, yeah.
Thanks.
No worries. Anyone else? Perfect. I think we're done. Thank you very much, guys.